And I'll click the accept button. Okay, there we go.
Awesome. So tell me who you are and what do you do?
So my name is James Fallows, or Jim Fallows to you, Professor Pollock,
Mhm.
and I'm a longtime reporter and writer. I worked for the Atlantic for many years. My wife Deb and I now run something called the Our Towns Foundation. We're
Mhm.
trying to change the center of reporting from smaller town America.
Ah, perfect. Yes, and I should say it's great to talk to you. And we've had a nice opportunities over the years, mostly electronically, but occasionally in person. They're uh, so maybe we should start with so tell me about the Our Towns sort of project, and then we'll get into some economics from it.
So the brief version of our project is, for decades, I've reported
Mhm.
around the world. We lived in Japan for many years and China for a long time. And
Mhm.
my emphasis as a reporter is how on the ground realities differ from sort of abstract observations of how much different China, for example, looked city by city than it did if you're just reading about the power of Shanghai or Beijing. So
Mhm.
applying that lens in the US over the past decade, my wife and I have mainly written about how different community level America seems, especially in interior states, than what you read about in the mainstream press. So the mainstream press would be guy in a diner talking about his complaints, whereas the reality of cities in Kansas or Indiana or downstate Illinois or Ohio was so much richer and more complex, more three-dimensional. So what we're trying now is mainly to expand that narrative of giving a more realistic, proportionate sense of the ways in which local level and regional level America is responding to all the economic and other pressures of this time.
So what do you think if we went, say, to downstate Illinois or some of the areas that you've visited, written about, studied, what do you think are the big economic challenges that people are most concerned about in these places?
I think the fundamental economic challenge is a combination of two things. One is
Mhm.
disruption and dislocation. This has been a constant through American life. Essentially, if you read the history of any decade of American life,
Mhm.
you'll see people being disrupted. My own family, my mother grew up in foster homes because her father had lost his business during the Great Depression. Through the long chronicle of American life, people have been disrupted. That has been going on now. The other is precariousness of
Mm.
people who feel they are one flat tire away, one bad experience away from being in a whole different situation. So at a time when the American economy in general is actually recovering, when the unemployment rate is statistically low, when manufacturing is returning, when many macro trends are positive, many micro trends still show the vulnerability of Americans. So I think both those things are simultaneously true. It's a time of dislocation, it's a time of opportunity and of dislocation. So the challenge is to match people who need opportunity with the opportunities that exist.
So what are some of the creative strategies that people are using to try to respond to that?
Well, I'll give a couple of illustrations of from the footprint of the University of Chicago, where a dozen years ago, you and I, Harold, were there at the same time, and I enjoyed
Yes.
teaching a writing class there.
Mm.
In Muncie, Indiana, not that far away,
Mhm.
the public university there, Ball State, which many of your students may know about, has
Mhm.
undertaken a radical effort to make the community's welfare its welfare. Muncie is famous in sociology as a location of the Middletown study, 100 years ago
Absolutely.
by
Yes.
the Lynn family,
Yes.
and that it's now a place where something has gotten very little national attention, of a university using all of its leverage in terms of having the student newspaper become the community newspaper, and
Yeah.
having the university use its resources to try to guide the public schools. That is something that's important, it's innovative, and it's not really been covered nationwide. In lots of, I'll give an example in Mississippi. I don't know if any of your students know the area called the Golden Triangle of Mississippi. It's the
Oh, yeah, they've
northeast
watched
part
your
of the state.
documentaries. Yeah.
It is part of our documentary, Columbus, Starkville, and West Point,
Mhm.
where they've decided they're going to use the power of Mississippi State University, which is there, and a community college called East Mississippi Community College,
Mhm.
and a public school called Mississippi School of Math and Science, to bring new manufacturing jobs there and to give new chances to people who have been in prison or have been, outside the workforce, or just have not been had opportunities. And I think we've seen around the country, in the city of Dayton, I'll give one more illustration. The private Catholic university, the University of Dayton, and the community college, Sinclair Community College, have a really innovative partnership to try to recreate in Dayton some of the opportunities that have been lost when a lot of the big manufacturing industries left. So I think there's a lot of creativity going on that is at least should be recognized with all the other national level disasters we're aware of.
Now, what are some things that are really hard to deal with at the local level that people are facing, where you realize we need a national response to the issues that Muncie and the other places you've mentioned are facing?
That's an excellent, a typically excellent question. And we can see in America's history how national level efforts made a difference. For example, the landscape of the US is still transformed in the 1930s by the Civilian Conservation Corps under Franklin Roosevelt and the things that were undertaken. When I worked in national politics in the 1970s for Jimmy Carter, when he was running for president, he would give speeches all around the southern half of the country talking about how the Rural Electrification Administration had brought electric power to towns like his in Georgia when he was a boy, and just how that had transformed things. So, and the highway building under Dwight Eisenhower in the 1950s. And I think there are large scale infrastructure and renovation and renewal and opportunity things which happen at the national level. And so national and global politics really matter. But it's also the case that a lot of leverage at the moment appears to be local. So I think it's one of the mottos that my wife Deb and I had when we were living in China is that everything important is contradictory. And so it is true simultaneously that national level initiatives have made a big difference over the years, but that also at this moment, the leverage seems to be at the local level. So both those things are true, I think.
So just our students are introductory microeconomics students. And so I want to ask you what's about the strengths of economics and about the blind spots of economics in the worlds as you have seen. So what is the strength of economic reasoning that students really should imbibe and be ready to deploy to understand social and policy problems?
That is another great question. And I speak as somebody who studied American history and literature as an undergraduate. Then I studied economics in graduate school. And what I valued in economics was the logical tools it provided to be able to think about data, to have a kind of rigor, to think there are patterns here, there are correlations. You can see how things change over time. You can see how prices affect demand, how they affect, supply and demand. That's a real thing. Yeah. And you can see how how data can give you a real guide to comparing nations, comparing eras, comparing policies. So I think it's a very valuable tool for people to have. But like any tool, let's say a chainsaw, it can be used in responsible and irresponsible ways. And so I think that there are times in which the discipline of economics can think that only what is quantifiable matters, and that there are things that are sometimes thinking the laws of physics are like those of economics, and precision in measurement is precision in all. So I would hope that your students would study your excellent course and learn the tools of economics, but also then take economic history courses. But because I think that the evolution of institutions, the evolution of different parts of the country and parts of the world, the ways in which public and private enterprise have worked together, the influence of individuals, either at the sort of working level, with movements or reforms, or at the plutocrat level, they've made a big difference in life. So I study economic reasoning and economic history, then you will be ideally educated.
One of the interesting things is the way that the supply, by the way, there's a couple of things that you said that I think are worth noting. One, I think the judicious use of data is really valuable, that just understanding, one of the keys, we have to know how to use data and how to analyze data carefully, and but also the idea that every economic analysis is embedded in a historical and institutional structure. That, we draw the supply and demand curve. There's a ton of stuff that's the foundation. So like I assume that when I give you my credit card to buy a sweater, that I'm going to pay $20 for that sweater, and that you're not going to empty out my credit card account. There's a whole set of protections there, and expectations and social norms and everything that makes that possible for that transaction to occur. And people, I think it's one of the insights of economics is that people are always responding to incentives and trying to do, as given the information that they have available and so on. They're doing that within a society, within a legal, institutional, historical context. That and one of the things I say to my students is some of the best economists are people like Irving Goffman, sociologist, who say, I'm doing the job interview, and I was hospital. We live in a small town. I was hospitalized for a psychiatric disorder. Do I mention it in the job interview when you might know? That's game theory. But you need the sociological imagination and the psychological insight to be able to say, how are people going to behave in that situation?
Yes, I could not agree more. And I'll give just a couple of responses. One is, we all recognize how important it is to know how to do math. If you can't add, you can't multiply, you're at a huge disadvantage. But if those are tools and they don't guide every single thing you do in your life, whether you're finding a mate for your life or raising your children. My friend Nicholas Lemon, you probably know, Harold, who's professor at Columbia now and a writer, used this great example, said that, why is Steph Curry so great as a basketball player now? Partly it's because he is so great. But if the rules of the game had not been changed to create the three-point shot, his greatness would not have been recognized. It was a change in the rules that allowed him to become great under new rules. And I lived for many years in China. The rules there, my watchword was, any data coming out of China you should not believe, because it is all just sort of what if we're going to have, we project a growth rate of 8.2%, and that is what we're going to get. We're going to report 8.2%. And so data readings are important in China, but you also have to know the sort of the history, the sociology, and all the rest of how that data is produced.
Well, there are two things. But there's an old saying among Russian Jews that I can predict everything except the past when thinking about official stories of what happened. The historical stuff. Steph Curry's a great example, because if the rules of the game, it's not just a three-point shot, it's also, in 1989, Steph Curry stands behind the three-point line, and you basically send some big bruising player who's manhandling him and pushing him, pushing him in, foul, but what is now considered to be a flagrant foul. That was just, Rick Mahorn would just be hacking away at him, and someone of Steph Curry's ability would not be a superstar because he is not as physically rugged as you needed to be to play the Detroit Pistons in 1989 or whatever.
In Bill Lambier, him?
The silence of the Lambier. Yes. So we digress. No, I think that's so. Those are important. Those are important points. As you think about the economic challenges facing America, what do you see as the key challenges that we need to be addressing right now?
So I'll mention an internal and an external one. And I'll start with the external one. As I've mentioned a couple of times, I spent a lot of my life in Japan and China, and mainly looking at them as how they affected the international economic order and the international trading order. And I think that it is most of America's economic history has been guided by not by pure laissez-faire neoclassical neoliberal theory, but the idea that there was guided economic development for the country. If you think of the big industries in America right now, the infotech industry, the biotech industry, the aerospace industry, the agriculture industry, the military sales industry, on down a long line, they all were the result of intentional public-private partnerships in developing all those spheres, from the land grant universities on with agriculture and all the rest. And so I think externally, there's a challenge of finding the right way for the U.S. economy to interact with a world that significantly includes China and Japan and Korea and Europe and Mexico and all the rest. And I think there is interesting ferment across partisan lines on that front. Internally, the challenge is, of course, inequality and disparity. The United States has always been unequal as a society. It's always been in churn. It's always been challenged. But we're in the situation of a second Gilded Age now, where the top has gone up 100-fold, 1,000-fold, compared to when I was a kid in the baby boomer era. And so it's a matter both of having opportunities for people in the not the bottom, but the less advantaged, say 1/3 of the economy, making sure people have opportunities, and having a fair participation in life and to taxes and responsibility from the upper 2% of society. So I think it's the challenge that 100 years ago America faced also. That's the externally internal challenge from my point of view.
Yeah, it's funny, the inequality challenge, there's so many layers to it. There's this sort of really upper end of the distribution, the top 0.1% just having unbelievable amounts of wealth, and people that are, the number of billionaires is striking. Sort of a huge number of people have really huge amounts of money.
Yep.
But there's also, so that's one layer. But there's another layer that's sort of top 20% of the economy, sort of upper middle class people that we have, that we also are more separated from the rest of the economy than was true probably 50 years ago. That the life of someone who lives in a comfortable suburb, who sends their kids to excellent suburban schools, who has a 401k that they're able to assiduously feed for an entire career. When I think about my own peers, the number of people that I know who have, who are living that lifestyle that I just described, whose children are going to elite universities the same way that we did, who have $7 million in their 401k, like that. That's also an element of that is striking. I don't know if you've perceived that as well.
Yes, and I think you and I have not discussed this online or in person, but I guess without having thought it through, distinguish the things in this way. I think for the upper, let's say 1%, half of 1%, whatever the super plutocrats are now, I think that is a problem on a scale of John D. Rockefeller 130 years ago or whatever, of people just entirely out of touch with any other economic realities of the tens of billions of dollars, of whom there are many. And I think that, quote, something needs to be done one way or another about that. Then there's the other question of just connectedness in civic society. And I view that as much a civics issue as a sheer economic issue. And I guess the economic aspect that strikes me is more the vulnerability of people not in that class to something going wrong, the medical bill, the loss of job, the company shutting down, something happening that just puts people on a whole different trajectory. So, but the non-economic part of the upper 20%, I'll say, is the separation from civic consequences in terms of public schools, lack of public service. it is simply not tenable that there will be a military draft again, just for a million reasons.
Yeah.
And I was one of the people very, very actively resisting and opposing the draft during the Vietnam War, but I think it is a civic problem for America, symbolized by the draft, that there's no public service that people feel is part of the responsibility of citizenship.
By the way, there's an essay that you wrote, I believe it's called What Did You Do in the War, Daddy? I may have
The
got
Class War Daddy. And what did you do in the Class War Daddy from 1975? I wrote that in the Washington Monthly.
that addressed some of these issues in a very self-aware way about the people in Boston that were on a different side of the class divide from yourself. I should say, people who, if you went to Harvard and you were a Rhodes Scholar and a speechwriter for President Carter, and had a life of great distinction and earned privilege. But you saw that the kids in Irish Boston who were going off to Vietnam.
Yes. And so for the 30-second version of that, for the 99% of the population had never heard of it, is that I was talking about when I was from a small town in inland Southern California, from a modest background. My dad had been a Navy doctor, which is how he got out of sort of working class Philadelphia, where he had grown up. The Navy sent him to California. And when I went to Harvard in the late 1960s, it was in the height of the Vietnam War. And the draft physical, they had the Boston Navy Yard in 1970, in May of 1970, after the invasion of Cambodia. It was alphabetically by draft board. So they had the Cambridge board, which is all people from MIT and Harvard, and everybody had some excuse. You had asthma, you had a bad foot, I was too skinny, somebody was too fat, et cetera, et cetera. Then you had the Chelsea board, which was white working class Boston, and they all were approved for service in Vietnam. And that was terrible. That was the dirty secret of the Vietnam War. It's institutionalized now in the now 40 years of having a volunteer army. The army now, the military now, is not economically lower ranked in the population as a whole. Actually, it's economically above the population as a whole, for various reasons we can discuss, but it's separated from the population as a whole. And that's not good for a republic in the long run.
Yeah, by the way, one of the things that we talk about in other classes more than we talk about in my economics class is the way that complex systems create disparity. And so the complexity creates disparity because people with social capital are better able to navigate systems and to understand how to. So my wife, as you know, my wife and I take care of her brother. He's intellectually disabled. When I look at many public services that are nominally dispensed on the basis of need, and what I find is many of the people that are getting it are families like ours. And it's not that we've actually done anything. It's actually not so much like the Vietnam draft thing where you've come in and kind of shaded, pushed, some of the stories that you tell, there's an element of lack of integrity in the description. But it's just that it's just super complicated. And if you have someone who can help you navigate a system, then it's a lot easier for you to get access to that, that residential service for your disabled loved one that requires complicated paperwork than it is for a family that doesn't have access to expert help. And Pam Hurd and Don Moynihan have this amazing book called Administrative Burden Policymaking by Other Means, which is a classic. By the way, this is the classic Washington Monthly. This is the kind of thing that would be, and that is, it's striking to me how much that is an aspect of inequality in many systems, and it's not quite as gross as as what you just described between the Cambridge and Chelsea stuff, but its human consequences often just as profound. And I remember there was, sorry, I'm off on a tangent, but
No, this is very interesting. And also, I didn't actually know about this book, so I appreciate your telling me.
It's a beautiful book. It really is one of the classic books of political science / social services that I've seen in the past 5 years. That it's a beautiful book. And by the way, Pam Hurd is going to be another person that I'm interviewing as part of this series that you're in. So I will give you an example. I was doing a focus group on talking to caregivers of young adults with serious intellectual disabilities. We all were in, everyone had something called Fragile X syndrome, which is what my brother-in-law has. And we were all in this big room doing a focus group. And one of the women was there. She's about my age now. She's probably 59. And she was describing how she had her son was 19. He used a diaper and he had a lot of challenges. And she gets a call from a social worker and from the state. And this person says, "Are you in crisis?" And this person, she has other kids, whatever. She says, "I'm not in crisis, but I could really use some help." This other mom across the room who lived in a mansion in Winnetka says, "No, that's not what you say. When that person asks you that question, what you say is, I can't do this anymore. Like I'm in total crisis. In fact, if I don't get some help, I may take him down to the emergency department, just like leave him there because I just cannot do this. And it's affecting my marriage, whatever." She said, "That's when they call you, that has to be the worst day of your life. That is
Wow.
how you get help." By the way, this advice was offered in a very loving spirit. She was basically saying, people have told me how you navigate these systems, and this is what you do. And I was listening to this and I was thinking the sense of impunity that reflected, that I'm going to tell some representative of the state, I don't know that I can take care of my child or that I want to take care of my child anymore. And to be confident that's not going to lead to negative consequences for me in some way, that I've just, I have other kids, whatever. I'm talking to somebody who's from the state, like Department of Child, whatever. That just the sense of privilege in that was so great. And this woman who gave this advice, she had essentially done that, and that was how she got her child into services. And and it just somehow stayed with me. This is always, that just that's sort of an extreme example, but anyway, that's a striking that's hit me when.
And to respond on that point, if I could, a crude comparison, but one that strikes me. You're talking about the privilege in the sense of course, I won't get in trouble for making this claim. So I had and have two sons, and as teenagers, they were very rambunctious young men. And again, a difference between white and Black Americans is, of the many fears I had, one of them was never they would be mistreated by the police. That just is something that in a sense, I've come to recognize was a assumption that goes with being a white professional class person that I hadn't focused on. I mean, we lived in Japan when our children were in elementary school, and that was actually instructive because they were the object of sort of a negative racial stereotype in Japan, that people thought they were likely to be disruptive, likely to be violent because they were non-Japanese. And but the story you're telling just connects with me, in that way, among many others.
Yeah, there's so many. The number of people that I know whose sons got into some kind of trouble, but it's like it got taken care of, in some way, and in a way that the young people, if you sort of walked that way out of 700 yards,
Mm-hmm.
the young people do not get the same benefit of the doubt. It is, well, I have reached the witching hour. What have we not gotten to in this conversation?
So I will propose something that may or may not be within the boundaries of your class, but I will offer it. I've been alive long enough to have seen many waves of economic stress within the country, and I've read American history for all of my life. So I've seen. My theory is there's always been economic strain in the country.
Mm-hmm.
I think the argument over the past dozen years that economic strain has given us sort of racist politics.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure of that. I think that there's always been economic strain, but racist politics has been sort of intentionally whipped up at different times in our nation's history, which I think is the current time too. How does an actual economist think about that, and sociologist?
Wow, well, there's so many strands that, there's certainly there's an element. It's funny that there's a way in which it is sometimes in the interests of the privileged to exploit racial division, to the classic example being that the auto industry used
Mhm.
African American strike breakers for many years in Detroit, but there's also a sense in which very often it's the opposite, that white working class people and whites of other in other economic positions use the instruments of public policy to prevent markets from creating a fairer outcome. So like one of the examples that I mentioned in my class, I became very interested in the Japanese internment.
Mhm.
And I started studying, and the parallels to anti-Semitism in the Japanese internment are quite striking. And one of the things that came out of that was that there were very concrete economic interest groups, white workers, white farmers, who did not want to compete with Japanese Americans. It turns out Japanese Americans were extremely effective
Mhm.
in agribusiness in California, and also in other entrepreneurial activities, and their competitors were sometimes the most enthusiastic people pushing for internment. And there's certainly one of the things that we will talk about later in the course, how there's certain kinds of racism that markets deal with effectively, and there's certain kinds of racism that markets will reify and cater to. So like when my father was a young person, he used to tell me that when you walked into a department store in New York City, there was never a retail worker of color in Macy's or Bloomingdale's, anything like that, because customers did not want that. And same as like in Abercrombie right now, if you walk in, you're not going to see someone overweight or someone with a disability selling you an overpriced fancy shirt. That customers, if customers in athletics, if customers prefer white players, for a very long time, it was obvious to everybody that they were, like in baseball, it was very obvious that the Negro leagues had players that were of at least equal caliber to the major league players, but the fan base did not want that. And so there's I would give a granular, I think one needs a little bit of some of the Marxians would say, well, racism is something that the forces of capital attempt to perpetuate and exploit to keep labor divided. And sometimes that's true, but sometimes it's kind of the opposite. And so I would have to, I'm babbling. So I think I'm not giving a coherent response to that.
You're giving the sophisticated, it's complicated reply.
Yes, but also the incoherent is complicated reply. But I think one of the things that is true, I think, about an issue like racism is it is humbling from many different perspectives, and that no one perspective, no one analytic lens fully gets it right. I was saying in the class, by the way, I have one of the things I asked my students in the last class is what have you changed your mind about in the past 5 years or 10 years? And one of the things that I have kind of changed my mind about is the idea of reparations, that I do whatever I do, I am more I don't think it's politically realistic that one, necessarily could pass a reparations act of 2022, but the idea that there should be reparations, I'm much more open to, because I do think that politically, economically, socially, that that American racism is so embedded and has caused such harm. And when I read the case for reparations in Ta-Nehisi Coates, these are people living in Chicago now, that have stories of things that happened to them in my lifetime, where they were specifically harmed. And the idea that people should be compensated for that seems to me to be very understandable. I must say, the other thing that's humbling is I do think that it is it's complicated. I think there's a level, I think among our students and in the progressive world that I live, there's often a level of self-righteousness that leads to a lack of self-awareness about the things that we do in our own lives. I mean, I can't tell you how many University of Chicago seminars I have sat in where faculty members have excoriated people who white flighted from Woodlawn, which is the neighborhood just south of here, to Skokie. And I'm watching this and I'm thinking, I know you live in the catchment area of the University of Chicago Police Department. You send your kids to our university lab school, which does not admit children with learning challenges, and also is a bastion of, privilege. You're really not personally in a position to, you can say it is a really bad thing that people white flighted, but you should not feel that in your own life that you are living in any more admirable way than someone who said, I'm really worried the price of my house is going to collapse if this neighborhood racially tips, and so I'm fleeing to Skokie, because you've never had to face that.
Yeah.
You're a tenured professor at the University of Chicago with all the things that I've just identified as sources of safety, security, economic privilege, and so it is. And you and I know, this is not something I will discuss in detail with my class, but I'll just say that I am responsible for people who have some learning challenges, and I do find myself sometimes at variance with the community that I'm in, where we think that as individuals that we are that we live by a better set of values than other people, in a way that shows a kind of lack of self-awareness, and that we can benefit from racial privilege even as we're the person who is excoriating the structural inequalities of the United States. And so there's some humility that we have to bring to that is important. And I think some of the backlash towards that we see in America, that behind that's often expressed in an unworthy way, like through the Trump phenomenon, I kind of can see where people feel a sense of resentment. When I think about your story about the draft board, you could imagine those people who went through the Chelsea thing. If the Harvard alums are lecturing them about how you need to live a life that is more inequality, and they're like, hey, I'm the guy who went to Vietnam, while you had the asthma, the case of asthma that was remarkably serious for the 25 minutes that you were being interviewed, and then seemed to have healed up.
No, I agree, and so in something suitable for your students, I will say that you exemplify the combination of the economics, economics as a tool and history as a sort of matrix, but then menschhood and heart as
Thank you.
Of understanding that the human elements of all this, and I agree with that. I'll also say that my wife Deb's grandparents were all Bohemian Czech immigrants to Cicero.
Oh, wow.
And so they were all part of the Cicero dynamic within Chicago. And so we, and my own family includes a lot of people of that sort too. I have, I'll tell you when we're sort of off the record, I'll tell you one more thing about my, my extended family.
We'll save that for the non-recorded portion.
Yes.
It is, I mean, my life I've had aspects of my life that are on both sides of the counter, and it doesn't always lead me to have greater insight by any means. And in fact, but I do think there are times when it is helpful, and it is, and to sort of see the value of economics, and to see the value of what we teach, but to also see that we all come with our own positionality and life experience in that. So I'm going to stop the recording, And
I'll say to your students that you exemplify that combination. So should be grateful to be in your force field.
thank you. I have paid you to say that. So let me stop this